unpacking abstract nouns and putting the participants back into the process of colonisation, because I asked my class about the impact of colonisation on indigenous people. And they said, the British invaded Australia, they might say that they colonised it, but how can you colonise something that had pre-existing inhabitants? After 10 years of Aboriginal colonisation, the population of Aboriginal Australians had decreased by 90%. Source 3 explains that having a strong cultural identity makes one feel proud, and being able to speak and maintain their languages increases self-esteem. We're all seeing the consequences today of the actions made over 200 years ago. We found carvings and footprints dating back thousands of years from the first Australians. There are also stories passed down from Aboriginal generations called the Dreaming, National Museum of Australia, Evidence of First Peoples 2019. All this evidence contributes to the knowledge we have of Aboriginals being the first Australians. It led to the loss of land, sickness, disease, loss of language, loss of culture, and introduced species to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So the government used the land for building towns and large settlements. It was the squatters who were taking over the bush community, and the government just couldn't stop it. There was a direct correlation with the fluctuation of the wool industry. Pearson History 2020. The squatter could go and take the land, farm their sheep on it as an investment in the hope of making a fortune. Source 2 shows that Aboriginal people used the land and had a connection to it. Reynolds 2003. It is evident that this process happened to the Aborigines, and participants in the process, according to Pearson, are squatters. Squatters who are really entrepreneurs risk going out into unknown country for large wealth in the wool industry. Pearson 2020, one of the factors of production is land. And this is what these squatter entrepreneurs needed. They stole land from Aboriginals, aided by violence and disease. It's evidence that dispossession happened to Aboriginal people during colonisation. This resulted in many Aboriginal people becoming landless, being pushed into parts of the land that Europeans didn't want. During the European settlement, a large number of Aboriginals were forced to share their land with Europeans and always had a smaller fraction to live on. This separation from the land was equivalent to the loss of identity for Indigenous people. This is because of the dreaming. It's a very important part of Aboriginal spirituality. It's connected to the land. And Source 6, an Aboriginal family sitting watching on the side, it can be inferred that that was where their tribe once sat. A native family of New South Wales sitting down on an English settler's farm, as they're labelled natives rather than being referred to as just people. Earl, 1826. In the population boom, Aboriginal people found themselves living in white settlements. The lack of resources caused by the restriction of certain land, as well as other factors, made some Aborigines resort to switching to a European-style diet, while others starved. They identified with their districts and took their name from them. Reynolds 2003. This text implies that Aboriginals were in a way connected to their land and it was very important to them. Some Europeans, including colonists who arrived in Sydney in 1788, had developed some resistance to disease due to earlier exposure to the disease. But as for Aborigines, it's a completely different story. There's no direct evidence, though, that links the outbreak to any of these suspects. Either way, this outbreak caused much devastation throughout the Indigenous community. The evidence says that over 70% of the Aboriginal population was killed by the virus, and if that was true, that the Europeans did use this as a weapon, they certainly did a good job, while on the other hand, European settlers were not affected by the disease as they had been effectively previously exposed to smallpox. That meant the disease was not detected by the settlers until Aborigines were found dead bearing the disease near 2008. It was reported by Governor Phillip in 1790 that within 14 months of the first fleet, half of the Indigenous population in Sydney had died from smallpox. The Englishmen made a vaccine for smallpox, but it was not available to Indigenous people. Some scholars believe this outbreak caused an abnormality in many future generations of Indigenous people, making Aboriginal people more at risk for illnesses such as respiratory diseases. In the present day, Australian Indigenous Health Infonet 2020, although thought not to be intended, the spreading of new diseases caused many deaths within the community and could be counted as an act of violence if it were deemed to be on purpose. Source 4 talks about smallpox in a way that makes it seem like the outbreak of diseases was not how it was made out to be, and the Europeans supposedly did not purposely bring the diseases to Australia. That would be more pleasant to think about it. But if Europeans were capable of doing other brutal things to Aborigines, they likely brought the disease in order to tear apart the communities and take control. Major Ross had fought in America and used smallpox as a way to fight off Indians. He knew how to use smallpox as a weapon. Meir Reynolds 2020. His motives were also clear: to make more Aboriginal land available for economics. There were motives plausible to support a deliberate introduction of smallpox in 1889. The intention is hard to track in history, and whether or not the British settlers knew that they would bring disease to the native people is up for debate. However, it can be said that they had seen this happen before with Native American tribes and should have predicted that the same thing would happen to Aboriginal people. Any reasons why the Aboriginal population was so susceptible to the illness compared to the white settlers? Aboriginal people had been isolated from the rest of the world. Their bodies did not have the immunity against foreign illnesses. The treatment methods they had didn't work against something so new. They were forced to stay in the same place because of loss of land of the settlers and couldn't rid their waste as they normally moved to new area and let old waste decompose. This was a nomadic lifestyle, but loss of land forced them out of it. Even if these diseases and illnesses were unintended, it still had a negative impact as the diseases killed so many of the population at the time. Throughout the colonisation of Australia, there were multiple massacres against Aboriginal people because they tried protecting their land from European settlers. This lithograph shows policemen riding on horseback fighting the Aboriginal people. According to the Australian War Memorial, the New South Wales Mounted Police was founded by Governor Thomas Brisbane on 7th September 1825. They were recruited from a British military regiment stationed in New South Wales at the time to protect travellers, suppress convict escapees and fight the Aborigines when needed. Mounted Police in Blacks 2020 was also at the time of the Waterloo Creek Massacre of 1838. The worst part of this is the government forces were participating in these attacks and as leaders probably conveying that it was the right thing to do. This killing was carried out by police, showing that the massacres were not some people going off the rails but planned attacks that white settlers thought were fair. Other massacres showed that they were largely revenge or justice-serving massacres, but each time the death count of Aborigines was several times higher than the crime should have warranted. The white settlers didn't care that this was an unfair fight, as indigenous people of Australia didn't have anywhere near as advanced weapons as they did. The Aboriginal people could not have done much to prevent this from happening because the British had much more advanced technology and weapons. One of the issues was the language barrier between the indigenous and Europeans. Before white settlement, the indigenous people spoke 250 different languages. The majority of these languages were lost, with only 13 being properly spoken to date. The evidence from Source 7, Monday 1852, implies disadvantages Aborigines had amid the massacres. Source 1 and 6 corroborate with each other as Knight 1839 and Earl 1826 both convey a short-term impact. Wilson 1856 wrote that Europeans had nearly swept them off the face of the earth within 20 years, or had at least tried to. They had shot them, gained their trust to poison food, infected them with diseases, and made them outcasts on their own land. He admittingly wrote that they were rapidly consigning them to entire annihilation. This shows that the Europeans knew exactly what they were doing, but had no remorse when doing so. Collectively, all of this played a big part in the population decline of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Along with the physical impacts of colonisation, such as disease and violence, there are also more abstract consequences, one of which being the impact of colonisation of Australia had on the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture. An important long-term effect of European settlers' treatment of Aborigines is the stolen generation. From 1910 to 1970, there was an attempt to assimilate all Aborigines. They endeavoured to change them through paternalism. Paternalism meant that they were looking after Aboriginal people in the belief that they could not do it themselves. The sequel of this belief led to the stolen generation and continued mistreatment of Aboriginal people. These paternalistic actions what created the need for Kevin Rudd's 2000 apology to the stolen generation, Darlington, Smithies and Wood, 2017. These traumatising events have led to the intergenerational trauma which has lasted many decades and is still here to the present day. That's unpacking abstract nouns and putting the participants back into the process.